Every method has a few parts to it. It has modifiers, a return type, a method name, the method parameters, and the method body. There are other parts, but these are the most important ones to be aware of. Let's have a look at createGreeting in more detail and go over each of these parts. First, we have the modifiers. In this case, the only modifier that we have is private. This is an access modifier, and what this means is that the createGreeting method will only be available within our greeter class. What that means is that we could not, for example, access it inside of greeterTest over here. But let's go and try and see what happens. We can say g.createGreeting, and since createGreeting only takes in a single string, we'll have to change our arguments. And let's go ahead and try compiling this. As you can see, the compilation fails. And this is because it's a private method. Now let's go and change that into a public method and see what happens then. As we can see, the compilation and the running of the code is successful once we've changed that to a public method. This begs the question, why would we want to make anything private in the first place? We do this that way so we can encapsulate our logic and be sure that the use of our class follows a certain procedure. So for example, if we wanted to be sure that whenever somebody is using the greeter class and they're being greeted with a first and last name, that we first announce something before that, we could add that in the code very easily here. We could say system, we could print out something here. Let's say we are about to greet, and then we'll just concatenate with somebody's first name. And now every single time that we try to greet somebody with a first and last name, it will always print this out. Let's go and change this back into a private and give this a shot. We'll recompile and rerun, and now it says that we're about to greet Eduardo, greeting Eduardo Bake, welcome to Coding Dojo. Of course, this is a trivial example, but you could imagine a more complex scenario where you'd always want to have some functionality preceding another method call. The other access modifiers are public, which you've seen quite often, and it's also the default, which means if we don't include any access modifier here, let's go and recreate this where we're saying createGreeting, then we'll default to public. Although, of course, we have to make sure that we include the correct number of arguments. And as you see, it works now. The other one is protected, which means it will only be available to subclasses, which means that when you create a subclass from greeter, which we'll learn about more later, you will be able to use this same method. Next, we have the return type, in this case string, and let's put our modifier back on here. This tells us the method will return a string no matter what. Let's try changing the return type and seeing what happens. We'll change it to int. And here we get another error because it's not going to be returning an int, it's going to try to return us a string. This will prevent us from making simple mistakes that can be easily avoided just by having a compiler check for us. Let's change this back to our string. After this is our method name, which will always be a camel-cased verb, although when you have Boolean values, it's going to be a state of being verb, something like is empty or has contents. Here, we have it as createGreeting or greet. These all describe what it's doing, and they allow us to talk more easily about the flow of a program. For example, I have my G as my greeter object here, and I could say G greets Kelvin, in which case the code would look something like this. Where G is the object, greets is going to be the method it's doing, or the action it's doing, and then Kelvin will be one of the arguments for it. It is convention to make sure that our method names are always some sort of verb or action. Aside from this and making sure that you camel case your methods, there's not much else to them. Let's move on to our parameters. Similar to our functions, our parameters also have a type associated with them. In this case, we have a string of a name. And what that means is if we try to give our method anything other than a string, it would not compile. Let's try. Also, let's fix this other error here. Now let's try compiling our code. And as it says here, int cannot be converted into string greet24. And that's because we're trying to give a integer in where it's expecting a string. Of course, if we wanted to do that, we could instead change it to that. Now it will compile as expected. Aside from method name and parameters, the other and possibly most important part of a method is a method body. This is where all the functionality is defined. You've already been writing inside the method body for quite some time, so we don't need to speak about it all. The only thing left to talk about is the static modifier. You see this on your main method quite a bit. This is the most used modifier that you see that is not an access modifier. This is due to its use on the main method. All the static modifier does is tell us that a method is a class method and not an instance method. Now what does that mean? That means that we can use this method without the class actually being instantiated. Let's create a static method now and see how they work. So of course we have to name it public, and then we'll give it the modifier of static. Let's say we'll have no return type similar to our main method, and we'll just call this one test greeting. And here we'll give it a string, and we'll have it be a name. And in here, we will print out from the greet class itself just a string that's been concatenated with our name. And here we concatenate with our name. And now we should be able to reference this inside of our greeter class without actually instantiating the object. So we can comment out all of this code, and we can just say our greeter.test greeting and give it a name of Kelvin, and this should compile. Now as you see here, we are able to use this method without actually instantiating any of the greeter class objects.